Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Professor and the Idiot. I'm Nick Wolfinger.
I'm Amy Newberg. I'm the idiot.
An ongoing subject for much debate, criticism, and wonder. So today, we're very happy to have Sam Perry with us. Sam is a professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma, where he was tenured early because he was a rock star. Sam received his PhD from the University of Chicago 5 years ago. Before that, he received a master in theology from the Dallas Theological Seminary, making him the only other clerical sociologist I'm aware of besides the late Andrew Greeley. Sam has published 3 books and many scholarly articles. He tweets under the handle Soch of the Sacred. So we have many questions because Sam has published much research, and especially in the topics of pornography and Christian nationalism. So actually, can I ask a question before you start talking about porn, Amy, as you're wont to do?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm on the edge of my seat wanting to talk about porn. Go for it.
Okay. And that is, Sam, had you anticipated joining the clergy before you heard the call of sociology?
Yeah, that was the goal. So I joining the clergy, that was kind of the family business for me. I grew up in a very evangelical household. I actually went to the same seminary that my dad went to. And so that was kind of a path I'd always anticipated, but I got to seminary and it turned out I really liked research and writing. And I didn't like all those people. And so I thought to myself, man, being a pastor would be great if it wasn't for all these people. And so I figured what would allow me the opportunity to read and study all day and communicate without having to do all the stuff that the pastors have to do. So I figured professor sounded like the best job for me.
That's really interesting. What didn't you like about all those people?
Oh, I'm halfway joking. I mean, I think, I tend to be, actually, I think, to be honest, I underestimated in college and in seminary how introverted I am by nature. And so I think I would, and in fact, I had worked in ministry for some time, and without knowing just how I was, I would get to the end of the week and be emotionally exhausted, which to me manifested itself as depression. And not in a suicidal kind of way, but just really, really down, really discouraged. And I think looking back at that time, it was just me not understanding how I recharged and what being around people constantly was doing to me. And so I think being a professor allows me the opportunity to go and teach, which I've always loved doing. And to give talks and to speak in front of people and communicate what I'm thinking about to an audience without kind of the constant piranha bowl of being in the pastorate where everybody takes a piece of you all day long emotionally. And so I think just the way I'm designed naturally just didn't suit me well.
My father was a professor, and so that was the family business. And my mother once had a very pithy insight into why people become academics.
Okay.
And she said, people become academics because they want to be left alone.
Especially research academics. I mean,
Yes.
That's definitely what we, and it's kind of funny. I have a lot of people in my family are academics as well. Not my parents, but I have uncles and aunts who are professors and presidents of universities. And so that was also a family business track for us. And I grew up and I had an uncle who was a professor, several who were PhD, at PhD granting institutions. And occasionally they would just offhandedly remark about how they couldn't wait to be alone and how they were just so tired of their students and they just wanted to be, and that wasn't my idea of what being a professor looked like. I thought it was kind of like being a pastor. And it wasn't until I actually became a professor that I was like, oh, that's exactly right. Like every day, it's like my goal is like, how much alone time can I carve out for myself so that I can do research and write. And of course, I don't begrudge the time I get to spend around my wonderful students, but But you're right. You're exactly right. It is a whole lot of alone time, which for an introvert like myself is just heavenly. Yeah,
So you're in Oklahoma.
I am.
Is that a very religious place to be? Are your students religious?
Absolutely. Yeah. Belt buckle completely and we are, it's Oklahoma is a difficult thing to summarize because it's kind of Midwestern. And I would say that Oklahomans themselves, like if you asked Oklahoma, what part of the country are you from? Are you Midwest or are you Southern or are you Southwest? You could probably get a variety of different answers, unlike what you would get if you asked somebody from Georgia or if you asked somebody from Ohio or, that kind of thing. And that's because geographically they're kind of in the plains, and I've heard people refer to Oklahoma as the Midwest, but it also has definitely a red state feel to it. Absolutely. It's a church on every corner, very dominated by Baptists, red state politics in all of the really challenging ways, everything that means and implies. And so in some ways it's kind of an extension of Texas politics and the things that Texans value in that regard, but without a lot of the diversity to create this kind of racial threat experience that Texans kind of feel. And so I definitely think Oklahomans are on average quite religious as far as states go. Yeah.
So do you have to be very careful with your students talking about religious issues?
Right. I think by default, I tend to be pretty, and I don't know if accommodating is the best word. I tend to be pretty careful in just how I communicate things, just so that I avoid giving offense at all. I don't want to pick fights that don't need to be picked in that regard. And so I think I definitely wouldn't. I mean, you couldn't read anything that I've written, frankly, and think that I've given evangelical Christians a pass, or that I've gone soft on like evangelicals, or because that is my home community and my people in my family and what I grew up with. I feel very comfortable critiquing that subculture as an insider, and so in that way, I haven't been overly cautious in the way I've communicated. But in terms of like students and their experience in the classroom, I've always tried to offer whatever caveats I need to offer, so that people don't feel like I'm attacking them personally, but I'm more so critiquing ideas or patterns or social, systems of thought or culture, that kind of thing.
Has there ever been, have any large evangelical pastors or outlets ever invade against you on the basis of your research?
Oh, I wish. That would sell so many books, Nick. I would. I mean, if you can work some strings and maybe get some of those pastors to just tweet against me or something like that, that would be. I'd eat that up. No. So I would say. I mean, I've had a lot of my stuff has been reviewed in Christianity Today, and I wouldn't say that all of that was just effusive praise of my work. I mean, they definitely had critiques of maybe some political stances that they picked up that they disagreed with. Usually that has to do with things like gender or gender politics. If they feel like I've criticized complementarianism, or if I've challenged kind of the anti-gay marriage stance.
Okay, quickly, what is
yes.
complementarianism?
Oh, that's a great question, Amy. Thank you for pushing the clarification there. Yeah, so complementarianism is this. It's a theological, but you could just call it a theological belief. Oftentimes it's kind of an identity, but it's basically a theological position that holds that God has made men and women with essential differences, and that those are not just cultural, but that God has made men and women with essential complementary differences. And so men and women are designed to complement one another. It doesn't necessarily mean, they would say this, they would say that does not necessarily mean that one is more important than the other. So they are equal in value in God's eyes, but they are qualitatively different, and they're designed to be. And so women are designed to be responders. Men are designed to be initiators and leaders. Now, the way this plays itself out is that in complementarian families and in churches, the idea is men are the ones who lead. Men are the husband is the head of the household. He also gets to be the pastor and the elder of the church. Women can certainly serve in those capacities, and it doesn't mean they're less important in their terms. But it does mean that they can't hold the position of like pastor or elder, and they can't really like lead their families and that kind of thing. So if these Christian magazines or periodicals have come out against me, or if they've critiqued my work, it usually is kind of pushback from me pushing them on that kind of complementarian position. But at the same time, I wouldn't say like none of them have ripped apart my work. I think they've done a pretty good job of taking in the meat and spitting out what they perceive to be the bones of disagreement there. Now, who knows? Today I did an interview with the Christian Post, a magazine that is pretty far right of Christianity Today. They've actually come out as pretty pro-Trump. And I wrote an article recently with some co-authors, Andrew Whitehead and Joshua Grubbs, that is getting some attention. But it was basically showing that this ideology we call Christian nationalism is essentially one of the leading predictors that during the height of coronavirus, somebody behaved irresponsibly, or that they did not do the things that medical professionals and healthcare professionals are recommending that they do. So, for example, people who adhere to what we call Christian nationalism were the least likely to wear masks or socially distance or wash their hands more often than they would normally, or use hand sanitizer. And they were the most likely to go out to gatherings of 10 or more people, or to go shopping for non-essential items, or to go to a restaurant, that kind of thing. And so they were curious. It's kind of blown up. This is getting a lot of attention. We're grateful for that. But the Christian Post, I was kind of curious what this pretty far right-leaning magazine would want to make of that study. So we'll see when that comes out. I'm sure I'll tweet that out. But
I tweeted about that study, Sam. I think I tagged you.
I saw that. Yep. I saw that. Thank you.
That's a good segue for us into our notes about what we wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
Can you define Christian nationalism? I'm pretty sure I know what it means, but it's always good to have these things on figurative paper.
Yeah, sure. So, and I just took place, Nick, I took part in a kind of a one-day mini conference with some scholars who are doing work in politics of religion, like Penny Edgell or Ruth Bronstein or Paul Jupe, or some kind of half sociologists and half political scientists. And a lot of them were talking about Andrew Lewis was another one. He's at the University of Cincinnati. A lot of them were talking about Christian nationalism, and we kind of realized that a lot of us are working with different definitions of what we're talking about here. And so I think it is good to define that term. What we mean by Christian nationalism, and what I mean by it, is an ideology you could look at it as an ideology or even a discourse, like a way of talking about things. But it's basically let's just call it an ideology that idealizes and advocates the fusion of a particular kind of Christianity with American civic life. And so when I say a particular kind of Christianity, I don't mean somebody asked Jesus to come into their heart, or that they, want to live as Jesus did, or all of that kind of vague generality Christianity kind of thing. I mean a very specific kind of Christianity. So when these people want to fuse a certain kind of Christianity with American civic life, what they mean by that term is what I would just call a dog whistle, right? So like, you're familiar with that term, dog whistle politics.
Oh, yes.
If I want to say something ugly about a group, a minority group usually, and I don't want to be overt about it because it's offensive, but I want to communicate to a particular audience that you know who I mean. So I would say urban or terrorist or illegal, when everybody knows I mean Black, Muslim, or Mexican, right? But I haven't said that explicitly. So for this group, the word Christian is really a dog whistle, and it means people like us. It means white, native-born, culturally conservative, Christian if necessary, but really culturally conservative is kind of the point there. And so what these people want to do, I would see people who are higher on Christian nationalism want to see this kind of fusion between this particular kind of white, native-born, culturally conservative Christian identity with American civic belonging. And that plays into how they vote. It plays into the issues that they want to promote. plays into the boundaries that they want to draw between who is a real American and who is an outsider. And so that's kind of what we're working with. And so that's the kind of ideology that I'm talking about. So people who score higher on that version of Christian nationalism, that idea, tend to disregard the recommendations of scientists, and they tend to be skeptical of anything that comes out of the mainstream media. And they throw a lot of trust behind Trump. And so you can imagine that situation. They were definitely more likely to say, hey, screw masks. I'm not gonna wear a mask. I'm not going to socially distance. This is probably a conspiracy anyways. And so I'm not fearful of what this is going to do to me. And so so that was the leading predictor of that kind of irresponsible behavior.
Just back to Christian nationalism.
Sure.
Is there not also some element of this country was founded on Christian nationalism, and we are really what America's all about, and nobody else belongs here?
Oh, for sure. That's definitely a narrative that comes into play there. So Christian national, that kind of myth is wrapped up in that discourse of Christian national, that way of talking, that language that kind of gets thrown around. But again, whenever you hear that, Amy, and I would argue this is almost every time the case. Whenever you hear somebody making a statement about, hey, this country was founded on Christian principles, or we are a Christian nation, you got to listen carefully for what kind of Christian they're talking about, right? Like right. They don't mean that in a broadly ecumenical. They're not talking about Episcopalians or liberal progressive. They're not even talking about like Black Protestants, who are also very committed and very conservative on a lot of social issues. They're talking about white, native-born, culturally conservative Christians, people like us. And that's what they really mean. They mean this country was founded for and by people like us, and therefore it should stay that way. And that really is kind of the thrust, right? Like, we need to take our country back from the liberal, secular, atheist infidels who want to take our country and have been taking it since, the last, whatever they would trace that back to. I think a lot of these folks trace it back to like when the Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s started, making it unconstitutional, declared it unconstitutional for institutionalized prayer and Bible reading in public schools, right? You can still read a Bible, you can still pray, but you can't, like, as a teacher, make kids do that. And so I think a lot of these thinkers and a lot of the discourses wrapped up into, well, when that happened, all of a sudden you've got this kind of antagonism between the state and what they perceive to be a Christian government now is not a Christian government. Now they're kind of against us. And that's where the victim status kind of starts to come in, is like, we're isolated here and we need to fight back. So
is fighting back part of the anti-mask sentiment?
I think so. I think that goes along with this kind of cultural opposition thing of conspiracy, of the media is super liberal, that medical experts and scientists pose really an epistemological threat. Like, they claim to have authority. They claim to have moral authority. We are the ones who should have authority, right? Like, and the ones who are culturally, the way we always have been, or we follow tradition, or we follow, vaguely Christian kind of understanding of like what is moral and right. And so they would see this kind of whole conspiracy of media plus scientists plus medical experts. I can't trust them, but who can I trust? Well, I can trust the people who said they're going to fight for me, and that right now is Donald Trump. We have some data, though, that shows that when Christian nationalism, when we're looking at Christian nationalism, this ideology, definitely more likely to trust like Breitbart News and Fox News, and to be basically less trusting of every other news source. I mean, it could be anywhere. It could be certainly like CNN or MSNBC, but also ABC, NBC, CBS. Basically everybody except Breitbart, Fox, and Trump, they would distrust in terms of like where they're going to get accurate information.
Thank God they have One American News.
Oh my goodness! We didn't even when we were asking these questions on the survey, we didn't even know about One American News. But I would strongly believe that. I mean, if you've ever seen One American News,
yeah,
John Oliver had a great segment
I
on
saw
that a couple months back, and it was just brilliant and shockingly scary. Scary. It was the best word for it. I mean, just what they are saying on there, and the fact that Trump actually gives them a voice, right? Like in his briefings. I mean, it's just, yeah, shocking is the best. I mean,
I also wonder whether people who are not paying attention to science and are not necessarily well educated in analytical thought or thinking for themselves, looking, reading things and then making assumptions based on knowledge, are a lot more likely to be affected by what the people around them are doing. And that maybe that's also that sort of tribalism is a big part of this whole mask and non-mask thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely an us versus them kind of mentality here. And some of that, I thought you were going to say, I thought you were going to go towards the education aspect of this, and because that's another kind of part of this that.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to be too offensive.
No, I understand. I understand, and they do tend
Wait,
to be
offending who, Amy?
I don't want to just assume that Christian nationalists are uneducated, but
less educated. Well, if they are, I believe they are less educated. But if they are, though, it is. But there's also a skepticism there of, liberal, godless sociology professors like myself, or and I'm just joking there, but like the understanding of like the secular liberal professor who wants to challenge everything that I believe and shipwreck my faith and replace my traditional Christian values with this kind of progressive atheistic values. And so even if there weren't a huge disparity in terms of educational attainment, there would be in terms of who people trust to deliver accurate information.
So you've seen data that show how many Christian nationalists there are in America?
Yeah. So by our measure, and we have a book out called "Taking America Back for God," where we really kind of break this down pretty clearly. And we've tried to do this in all of our papers, but we kind of incorporate the measure that we've been using. So what we do is to measure Christian nationalism, and we don't say that this is the best way. This is the way we've been doing it. We feel like it's pretty effective and is helpful. But what we do is we have 6 questions. They're like 6 statements, and we ask respondents to indicate their level of agreement with the following 6 statements. And these statements are like: the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. Pretty clear. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. So they believe we have a special relationship with God, people who agree with that statement. The federal government should enforce a strict separation of church and state. And we reverse code that one so that people who strongly disagree with that, they don't want a separation of church and state, right? So we take all these 6 questions, these 6 statements, and we add scores up, and we basically end up with a score ranging from 0 to 24. And where you score on that, the higher scores indicate that you're more in agreement with Christian nationalist ideology. So what we do for the book is we divide up this so that we didn't say, it would be annoying throughout the book if we're saying, hey, this person is a 12.
Yeah.
This person is a 16. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what we did was we divided it up into 4 groups, into 4 quartiles of scores on Christian nationalism. And so it goes from the lowest score is like the rejectors of Christian nationalism, followed by resistors. And then cross the average on the other side, you've got accommodators. And then the true believers in Christian nationalism we call ambassadors. So this group of Americans that we call ambassadors, they basically score from like an 18 to a 24 on our Christian nationalism scale. These are the people who either agree or strongly agree that federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, advocate Christian values, prayer in public schools, special relationship with God, no separation of church and state, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's pretty clearly Christian nationalism. So that group makes up about 1/5 of Americans.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a minority, but it's a sizable minority.
That's many more than I thought. Yeah.
Right. So it's about 1/5, about 20%. Now, accommodators, who are also not as true blue Christian nationalists as ambassadors, but they also they're more favorable toward it than they are against it. They make up about 1/3. They're about 33% of Americans. And you can imagine, because like 33% of Americans would consider, this is a group that largely consider themselves Christian. they're a little bit ambivalent about like really strong statements about like this being God's country and we have a special relationship, and they maybe think separation of church and state is kind of a good idea, but they like religious symbols in public spaces like the 10 Commandments on the courthouse lawn or prayer in public schools. It's not a big deal, so they would be friendly to Christian nationalism, but not as ardently for it as ambassadors. Altogether, that's 33% of Americans being accommodators plus that fifth. You've got over a half of Americans, a little over 50%, that would be either proponents of Christian nationalism or friendly toward it. Not an inconsequential group of people. So I think that would be how I would explain, like, what's the level of agreement there.
So considering we're in kind of a life and death situation here,
Yeah, right.
What would you recommend for reaching those folks as far as socially and medically responsible behavior goes?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I don't think the ambassadors are really that reachable, frankly. Like I think that it's a culture war kind of thing for them at this point. Like you mentioned, Amy, the tribalism aspect of this. I think they're so dug in. I mean, we could try and they would just see it as, just more combative, finagling from the left. I think accommodators, right? I think that group of Americans who are Christians and kind of friendly towards some Christian nationalist ideas, but they're not so zealous about the idea that they could be convinced on several different things. I think you're more likely to find a whole lot of reasonable people among that population. And I think they would probably be swayed by a what I would consider to be a unified narrative about what is the most responsible thing to do. And, let me be clear, like I think the data suggests that most Americans are trying to do the right thing when it comes to coronavirus. Like they are trying to, or at least they say so on surveys. They're trying to social distance. They're trying to wear masks in public. We see on TV a lot of these, or YouTube, or Twitter. We see a lot of these videos of people throwing a fit in public and cussing somebody out or bowing up and picking a fight with somebody. Most folks are just kind of going with the flow and doing the right thing. So I think, and this is where I think Trump has been such a disaster when it's come to coronavirus in particular, in everything, but coronavirus in particular, is his really ambivalent kind of response to what we're supposed to do as a nation to fight this kind of thing. I really do think if Trump had come out and said, hey, we're going to listen to the experts on this one, we're going to do everything we can to love our neighbor here, and we're going to wear masks, even though it looks goofy, we're going to do it because it's like we're protecting other people, and we're going to socially distance. And you know what? We're going to do the hard thing. And even though it might cause the economy to kind of hiccup a little bit, we're gonna maybe not shut everything down, but we're gonna definitely take precautions to try to limit the amount of time that we're spending out of the house. I feel like so many more people would get on board, and lives would have been saved, frankly. And so I think those accommodators really can be swayed by, I think, a broad consensus, and especially if they get buy-in from Christian thought leaders who tend to be more conservative. If you get prominent Christian thought leaders to say, hey, we're gonna go with the mainstream on this, I think a lot of those folks would fall in line, which is why we probably would get to this eventually. When we're talking about November, what's going to go on in November?
Yeah, I was just going to ask whether you thought those accommodators might also be swing voters.
I think that's what we're seeing right now. So I think Ryan Burge, who is a political scientist, who I would say that everybody should follow on Twitter. I mean, like, the guy basically spends his day crunching numbers and putting out fabulous charts and graphs.
How do you spell that last name?
Burge, Burge, Ryan Burge. And he does it for free. I mean, he's just putting out these great visuals, this data visualization on American religious demographics. But he's also a political scientist by trade, and so he's putting out this great research. He was showing today, in fact, that and confirming that by the latest data, it looks like white evangelicals are slowly, in just by a few percentage points, but for that sizable a group, it means something. Backing off 5-7% of Trump support, or like likelihood of voting for him. And I think that's mostly, I wouldn't think that's any ambassadors. I think that's accommodators, right? I think that's people who are kind of following some of maybe leading Christian voices to say, you know, on this one, we gotta do something else. Trump is a disaster. We shouldn't throw our loyalty behind him anymore. And so I would like to think if we can get more prominent Christian leaders on board with saying, let's just call this what it was. It was a mistake. And let's try again in 4 years if we don't like Biden, and, you know, and they probably won't. But if they can either stay home and say, you know, we're just not going to vote for anybody, or if they can say, hey, we're going to vote Biden on this one, I think that really means something. Considering what happened 4 years ago, I'm not holding out hope. Part of me, the cynical side of me, thinks evangelicals are going to get twitchy and they're going to say, can I really vote for a Democrat? No, of course not. And then they're going to come out and vote for Trump again. But part of me hopes that what we're seeing in the polls right now is going to reflect some reality 3 months from now.
Let's talk about porn.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I don't mind saying this now. I'm really proud of that research. I'm proud of maintaining my integrity throughout all that. And here's what I mean. Like, I think the porn research is so heated with rhetoric on both sides. I mean, like, you've got people who want to outlaw it. Kelsey Burke, who is a phenomenal sociologist at the University of Nebraska. She's been doing great research on anti-pornography campaigns within the past few years. And since 2016, I think it's 29 or 30 states. So it's just in the last 4 years. 29 to 30 states have tried to pass resolutions declaring pornography a public health crisis.
Yeah.
It's primarily a red state phenomenon, but they want to pass a resolution. And even some legislators are trying to go even further and say, hey, we ought to put warning label. I don't know how you do that on pornography, but put warning labels on pornography, or
what?
Or even some kind of restriction.
What,
right?
warning, this is porn?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some kind of restriction beyond what they do, because they're that serious.
My mind is reeling with the possible warning labels.
It sounds ridiculous, and it is. I'm not sure how that would happen,
Yeah.
but on one side, you've got people who are they think porn is cancer and it's the worst thing ever, and it leads to every negative social thing that we're experiencing today sexually. Then on the other side, though, you've got people who are very much pro-porn, right? Like, would deny that pornography is even an entity, right? Like, it's all kind of a cultural construct, right? Like, what is pornography anyways? And is it really affecting people in a kind of negative way? And I would say what I've tried to do, because I didn't get into this as a porn researcher, even though I've written a lot of articles on this, I really got into it as a sociologist of religion and somebody who's interested in families. But what I've tried to do is just try to follow the data and say, you know what, where the data suggests to me that pornography seems to be negatively associated with some family outcomes or marriage outcomes or outcomes for couples or whatever, I've tried to be honest about that. And whenever the data have suggested to me that, you know what, this seems to happen for religious people, but not everybody else. And that actually was what the book was about. So I wrote this book called Addicted to Lust, Pornography and the Lives of Conservative Protestants. And what I argued in that book is what the data seem to suggest oftentimes is that whatever you think pornography's negative consequences are, it's way worse for conservative Christians and Protestants specifically. And the reason is it's because of shame and guilt. If you are not somebody who is a religious person and you look at pornography, maybe that's not something you want to tweet about, right? Like, you don't want to necessarily brag about how much porn you're consuming, but it's not something you're just racked with shame about, right? Like, you don't feel like a horrible person for doing it. You feel like, that's just kind of what I do. It's a private thing. But if you're a committed Christian and you feel like God was watching you and you feel like this violates the very essence of your moral personhood, and you look at pornography kind of consistently, well, man, you feel like garbage for doing that. And especially if you are married to another Christian who feels like you're garbage for doing that, that's going to damage the relationship and you're going to feel pretty bad. So what I think the data suggests, and this is what I argued in the book, is that pornography may actually lead to some negative consequences in terms of relationships. And we can talk about that. But I think a lot of what we see in terms of the negative impact of pornography is because of the religious scruples people have against it, is because it violates their deeply ingrained moral sense of like what is sexual morality. and it causes incongruence in their lives and conflict in their relationships, and so it really damages a lot for them.
How do you collect data about people's porn watching habits?
Yeah, so there's actually a surprising amount of survey data out there that asks people about how much porn they consume. I would say that some data are better than others. So for example, the General Social Survey, we all use it, but we use it begrudgingly because it since 1972, they've asked the same question, and that is did you watch an X-rated movie last year? So that's a horrible question for a variety of reasons. One, because now it's dated. Like, people who watch porn know what an X-rated movie is. Like, I kind of refuse. Like, people have asked me, reviewers especially have said, hey, do people even know what an X-rated movie is? Like, yes, of course, somebody who's watching porn knows what an X-rated movie is. But the problem is, it's just a yes/no statement, right? Like, if you just watched an X-rated movie last year. Another problem is, traditionally, the General Social Survey has asked these questions face to face, and you're just not going to get a lot of honest responses about that one, right? So you're not going to get a lot of people saying, yes, I watched pornography last year, if you got to sit across the living room from somebody who's asking you these questions. Now, better studies have been fielded within the last, say, 10, 15 years that ask questions. One, they ask them either over the phone, which is a little bit better, or they ask them online, like an online panel, or they use some kind of computer-assisted technology where for really private questions, you can ask, how much porn did you use? But the other way that this is improved is it's a how often question rather than a yes/no question. And so usually you can ask questions like, how frequently did you view pornographic material last year? 1 being never, or 0 being never, and 8 being several times a day, kind of thing. And so you can look at kind of a range of how often people looked at pornography.
Nobody's ever asked me to be in a sociological study. I mean, how do I know this isn't just like old people who are sitting around at their phones waiting to be called, as opposed to people like me who have their phones basically turned off?
Oh, that's a good question. So you're right. I mean, so bias in samples is always something that we have to think about when it comes to surveys. There's a couple of ways around this. Like, you're right. Like, there is a particular kind of person that even makes themselves accessible to complete surveys at all, let alone surveys where they know they're going to be asked about pornography. So that is one of these issues. The way surveyors, I think, now try to get around it is they try to weight samples. And so what they do is they basically develop a mathematical formula that tries to account for the kind of bias that we see in terms of who ends up filling out surveys. So they try to make the survey mathematically. It used to be where the General Social Survey, which is kind of the gold standard for surveys, the General Social Survey, historically, they did it honest, right? Like, they did a randomized data, sample of people that they could get a hold of, and they pestered you until you filled out the survey or you completed the survey, and they got like an 80% response rate. And so they could really make a claim to being pretty representative of the American population. Nowadays, nobody does that, right? Like, if you try to call people and say, hey, will you complete a survey? You won't even get 10% of people to respond to that. And so what pollsters like Pew or Gallup or YouGov or these kinds of folks have to do is they have to develop like an online panel, which is they have people that fill out surveys for money, that they agree to be a part of like an online panel. And there are millions of people who do this, so it's a very large group of people. And so they have these people fill out these online surveys, and they're anonymous. It's not like I can trace the data back to these people, but they fill out these surveys, and then what Gallup or Pew or YouGov will do is they will mathematically weight the responses so that they can adjust them to be like representative of the American public. Now, if that sounds weird to you, maybe I can understand that, but that's kind of how people have to do it nowadays. Maybe Nick can chime in here if I'm missing something.
Sam, you've done a better job of it than I could.
Okay. Well, that's kind.
So I've had many thoughts about this. The most recent is I haven't worked with that porn question on the General Social Survey.
Right.
But I have worked with the sex data there.
Yeah.
And every indication that I get is that the sex data are fairly reliable.
Yes.
I actually did a blog post about this just on my own blog where
Okay.
I looked at sex questions worded a couple of different ways. They produced the same answer. I contrasted the general social survey to that big Ed Lauman survey about sex.
Right.
And the data, they looked reliable.
Okay.
So I don't know how far we can go with that about, does that also mean they're asking the porn questions reliably? But most indications are that, the question that people lie about by far the most is how much money they make.
if they answer it at all, right?
Actually, you're right. Actually, that's the bigger point. Most of them will just lie about how much money they make.
Right.
Do either of you know anything about the amount of consumption of pornography among different religious and non-religious groups? Like, does anything show that people who are more repressed sexually are more likely to watch porn?
That's a good question. So there's some kind of funny research on this that I've been fortunate to be a part of. So in terms of survey data, it looks like, let's just talk about evangelical Christians. So in terms of survey data, evangelical Christians seem to consume pornography slightly less than everybody else, but the difference isn't as great as you would expect, given how much evangelical Christians say they hate porn. So we're talking about 10 percentage points, right? Like, it's not in terms of like who looks at pornography in a given week, that kind of thing. And the difference gets even smaller when you're talking about young people. So like young men, age between 18 and 30. The differences aren't so great. And the differences between Christian women and everybody else are reducing, because more and more women are watching pornography now these days. But now there's a funny trend, and either of you can do this. You can look at it yourself if you want to, because these data are publicly available. So Google Trends is a fascinating tool that allows you to look at what search terms people use when they're looking for stuff. And so you could go to Google Trends right now, and you could type in just the word porn. So if you just put in porn on Google Trends, and you maybe set the data to where it just gave you the years between 2015 and today, and you set it just to the United States, and if you reported back to me what you saw, what you would see is you would see a preponderance of searches in the southeastern United States, in the Bible Belt. And that actually holds true for a variety of search terms. When you look at, if you said, well, what about terms like gay porn or lesbian porn or free porn or that kind of thing, or porn addiction or something like that, what you would get is a preponderance of searches in the Bible Belt. And so what we did, and my co-author Andrew Whitehead and I did a study on this in the Journal of Sex Research, and what we did is we demonstrated that there is a strong correlation that doesn't disappear when you control for a bunch of other factors. We controlled for a variety of different things. There is a strong correlation between the percentage of a state, like how many like evangelicals in a state, how many people go to church, how many people believe the Bible, and how often Google searches for porn or free porn or gay porn, how much that shows up in that state. So what that suggests to me is that there's a lot of underreporting that goes on among evangelicals, one. But I also think it suggests that there is a subculture of not talking about sex and not talking about pornography. And you said the term repressed. Maybe a little bit of that is going on. Like, if I can't have sex outside of marriage, or if I can't experiment sexually as like a teenager, then maybe I'm more likely to search out porn on Google, right? As a matter of fact, that's actually kind of what I think is going on. I think if somebody is searching for porn on Google, they're not a very sophisticated porn searcher. People who search for porn normally kind of know what they're looking for. So you don't really type in porn into Google and just see what comes up. My guess is that's probably teenagers and young people who are looking for that. But I would argue that that's most likely to happen in a house where you're not talking about it. And so I think that what we saw in that study, which is higher percentages or higher frequencies of porn searches on Google, in evangelical dominated states. I think that's probably because of the subculture of kind of like repressing that conversation.
Can I add something to the conversation about porn and Google searches that I found fascinating, but I'm not sure what to make of it? It just seems like a broader cultural trend.
Okay.
Porn aficionado that I am, I'm signed up with Pornhub for their data drops. And so unfortunately, I asked them, they won't provide their data to researchers, at least not yet, but their own in-house data analytics team produces reports on their data.
Okay.
And so what's happened in the last couple of years is that Pornhub functions as a search engine of sorts.
Yes, right.
So if say it's Super Bowl weekend, people go in into Pornhub and they search for football or New England Patriots or
oh my gosh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so whatever's happening in the world, it's now rendered as porn searches and in theory porn.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what do we make of this? I don't know.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that was going on.
Yeah.
Honestly, Nick, and I thought this is where I thought you were going to go with the Pornhub searches. And whenever they make their data publicly available, I'll be fascinated to see this. But one of the questions I've had rolling around in the back of my mind is how Me Too and how the Me Too movement has potentially shaped consumption of pornography. I don't think I have witnessed in Google searches, and this is, again, admittedly, that's kind of limited. I mean, like who's searching for the word porn, really. But what I would be fascinated to know is if, as men in the workplace, all of a sudden got very concerned about hitting on women in the workplace, whereas they might have previously felt the freedom to say lewd things or to try to go fishing for some kind of a hookup at work, right, or to, and to go and find that person that they could score with sexually. As those men started to say, well, that's not safe anymore for people like me. And I'm not applauding what they're doing. I'm just saying, like, as they kind of recognize that, like, this isn't going to be an avenue I can really go down without consequences. I've been kind of curious. My theory would be that pornography consumption would increase in response to that. So I would be fascinated to know if, when Pornhub finally releases maybe if they have some kind of trends, I would be fascinated to know if there was like an abnormal one that didn't follow just the kind of the standard growth curve and how many people were consuming pornography. If that actually increased in response to whenever Me Too came about, say like 2017, that would be fascinating to me.
But you do seem to have data that shows porn has increased among women.
Yeah, but not to the,
I mean, watching porn.
That's right. That's right. So
yeah.
You've got, and the best way we know that is honestly that limited the General Social Survey. So
yeah.
The General Social, because it goes back to the early 1970s, we can track, how many people said I watched porn last year. And that seems to be increasing on average from year to year for women, and especially younger women. Just because, obviously you've got it on your smartphone. You don't need to be embarrassed about it anymore if it's something that's curious to you. I also think that's probably part of me thinks, because it only asks whether you saw an X-rated movie. My guess is more and more couples are bringing it into the bedroom as well. And so an increasing number of women might also be saying that's a part of my sex life as well. Like it's something that my partner and I do because that turns us on, it spices up the relationship and that kind of thing. So I don't, there's so much to crack open there. And I just wish I could go back in time. Of all the reasons, I know that's a dumb reason to go back in time, but I wish I could send an email to people. I would go back and do a lot of other things.
There are worse reasons to go back in time.
Yeah, right. But that would be among them is to send an email and to say, don't ask the question this way, maybe ask it a better way and we'll get some more data in the future.
Do kids who are 20 even know what an X-rated movie is?
That's the question. I got to think, if you're spending enough time watching porn, maybe if it's the only time you've ever seen porn in your life, maybe you don't know what an X-rated movie is. Right. I still think so. I do work with a lot of translators, like people who translate the Bible, and they talk about active and passive vocabulary. So active vocabulary meaning the stuff that we use every day, and passive meaning stuff that we never use but we kind of understand. And I would say that X-rated movie is in my opinion, undoubtedly in the American passive vocabulary. Like you got to know what an X-rated movie or a XXX movie is just by virtue of being a teenager and ever seeing porn in your life, even if you don't use it.
My browser is on Pornhub right now. To make a couple of points. One is you could look at plenty of videos on Pornhub and not see XXX or X.
Sure, right.
You know, there's just more descriptive words. Second, to support the point I made, I went to Pornhub and I searched Me Too.
Okay.
And that indeed produces hits of various kinds.
Wow.
Post Me Too couple and discovers pegging and 2.0 sex. Post Me Too era men are sluts, and men can't fuck women anymore, so they fuck trannies. And then in parentheses, post Me Too sex.
Wow. No, I did not know. I mean, Nick, that is the news I'm hearing right now is people are using it like Google. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wish I knew, I wish I could make some greater sense of it, but
yeah.
So you have a recent paper that seems to show that porn watching among couples has different effects on a marriage depending on who's watching the porn.
I'm trying to think of which one you might be.
That if a man watches porn, the quality of the marriage suffers, and if the woman watches porn, it does not. Did I get that right?
Yeah, right. So yes, so that one's from a little further back. So this is actually a common. I wasn't the first person. I was maybe one of the first to use some longitudinal data to document that.
What's longitudinal data?
Oh, excellent question, Amy. Thank you for forcing me to clarify.
That's my job.
No, hey, that's really important because sometimes we just kind of get into our little world here. So it's data that tracks the same group of people over time. So unlike the General Social Survey, which is fielded every 2 years, and it doesn't track, they have a what's called a panel component where at one time they did track the same people, but most of the time they just survey random people every 2 years. But other surveys that we would call longitudinal or panel surveys, they basically follow people over time. So they can actually see how they changed. And so what I did was I used some panel data, that longitudinal data that asks people the same question at different points in time. And what I did was I looked at data that looked at year one, how much porn did somebody consume? And then by the next survey wave, what was their marriage like? And what I found was the more porn men consumed at time one, the lower they rated their own marriage quality 6 years later. But that didn't seem to be the case for women. Now, that could be a couple of different reasons for that. I'm not the first person to find that finding, actually, that pornography seems to affect men's relationships more negatively than it does for women. And I'll explain that in a second. My own finding could be because maybe a small sample of women really were watching porn that much. Maybe just not a lot of women were watching porn. Maybe if I had a bigger sample, it would have showed maybe some more differences. But here's what I think is going on. For men, when they watch pornography, oftentimes or almost always, I'll say, when men watch pornography, it's for the purpose of solo masturbation. It's to watch porn, to masturbate by themselves, almost as you could call it a substitute or replacement for sex at that time. That's what they feel like doing, and so that's what they're going to do. Now, there's a couple of ways that could negatively affect your relationship. Like if you didn't masturbate to pornography, say earlier today, because you hadn't masturbated to pornography, you would have maybe pursued your romantic partner. Maybe you would have tried to woo them and date them and try to get them to have sex with you, treat them nice, engage in the relationship. Your relationship might have been a little bit better off if you had abstained from the porn for a second there, right? To be able to engage that person. Conversely, if you looked at porn and you masturbated and you really don't feel like having sex, maybe that just removed some incentive that you may have otherwise had to treat your partner nicely or to engage in the relationship in a way that was kind of romantic or that kind of thing. So that may just be an example of the way that pornography may affect a man's relationship in a negative way.
How do you get I mean, so there's a question of causality there.
Oh, sure, for sure, and that is where all of the studies have kind of crashed up against this rock of causation. That is, oftentimes people have found that there's a negative association between pornography use and relationship quality. The question is, do people who are unhappy in their relationship look at pornography, or because they're frustrated and they're not having sex, or is it people who look at pornography have bad relationships because they're looking at pornography, right? So what causes what? That's really difficult to disentangle. The point I was going to kind of visit with the women's pornography use and why it doesn't affect them so much is because I think women are more likely to use pornography within the context of a romantic relationship, not as a replacement for sex, but as something to spice up the relationship because the partner initiated, or it's something that they like doing together. And that's going to be less negative. That's probably going to have less negative consequences for the relationship because they're doing.
I have another theory.
Sure, please.
I think when women watch porn,
okay,
they mostly are interested in seeing other women have pleasure, and that's not threatening to a marriage. Whereas when men watch porn, they're interested in seeing women have pleasure, and that is threatening to a marriage because now someone else has become
a substitute or replacement.
A substitute or
invidious comparison.
A contest. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's possible. I think that's at the end of the day, I mean we need to collect better data on a variety of women. Not just women who have, because oftentimes even the research, and I'm pretty familiar with all of that research now, even the interview-based research that actually asks women how do they interpret their partner viewing pornography. A lot of it selects on women who are already really frustrated with their partner using pornography. Like it's women who are already offended, or they feel cheated on, or they feel like threatened by it. And so a lot of their reaction and their explanation is that he shouldn't want that, he should want me, and that kind of thing. But what we need is we actually need women from a variety of different perspectives who can really articulate, is this something that bothers you? If not, why not? Does it, or why does it bother you? And so I think that's a valid perspective, Amy. So I don't disagree with that at all. I think we just desperately need more and better data on how women experience personally pornography in the couple, because we just don't have enough of that.
Yeah, and what exactly people are watching, because
for sure.
Because seeing one X-rated film obviously is very different from having a porn addiction. That's and right. Specifically what you're watching can have different amounts of threat to a sexual relationship.
Exactly right. So are people getting turned on watching Game of Thrones together? Is that what they mean by pornography?
Yes. Yes.
Or is it a hardcore, something that would be, it's so like you said, the kind of media is also something that is oftentimes vague, and we just kind of assume porn means the same thing to everybody, and it doesn't.
Speaking of pornographic and what people view as pornographic, I intermittently teach an upper division class on divorce.
Okay.
It's a 15-week class on a single topic. I show a couple of feature films about divorce, and one of them is Kramer versus Kramer, which is a PG movie. And there is a scene in which for a fraction of a second, you see female nudity.
Oh, okay.
It's rated PG because the ratings were a little more liberal back then.
Right.
When I showed it the last year in my pre-corona class, I had a student who jumped up, turned her back, ran out of the class, and then said, I cannot be in class while you show pornography.
Wow. Okay.
So my trigger warnings were inadequate, apparently.
Yeah.
So that gives you the idea that people who are very culturally conservative might have very expansive definitions about what counts as porn.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would resonate with my interviews as well. They would say that if they've watched a Game of Thrones, they would qualify. A lot of the committed Christians that I interviewed would say that was pornography.
And what's she doing with that dragon anyhow?
But I mean, the amount of shame that's something that, like, I grew up in the conservative Christian subculture, and purity culture and all of that. So, and I consumed those books about like kissing, dating, goodbye, and all of the things that people
dating. Oh, okay, right.
yeah, kissing, dating. I kissed, dating,
yeah.
goodbye. Yeah, and I remember men that I was in like an accountability group with. We would hold each other accountable to not look at porn, and that's basically what the group was about. Like, let's just meet and talk about not looking at porn. and I don't know if you guys know this. Like,
that would make me just so want to look at porn.
Yeah, right. So, and that's actually there's a term in psychology called experiential avoidance, which means that it's just the continuing to tell myself, don't do this, don't do
right,
this.
Don't think about an elephant. Yeah,
that completely backfires. But that has been something that I found most fascinating to people who didn't grow up in that subculture, is the lengths to which people will go to avoid that. Like, Nick, you were talking about this girl standing up and turning around and saying, I got to avoid the porn. Yeah. I had a guy confess to me a long time ago that, hey, I've fallen sexually and I've got to confess it to you guys and repent. And we thought he was going to confess to something like, really, did you sleep with a girl or something like that? And he had a wet dream. I mean, so it wasn't even voluntary. Like he had a wet dream, and he thought that was something that crept up in his subconscious because it was sin, and he needed to, purge himself of that kind of thing. But to give you something that's a little bit more common, and Amy, I don't know if you even knew this was going on. There's something called accountability software, and this is something I actually have a little bit of a problem with, because I feel like it's a huge conflict of interest for these groups, these organizations. But if I'm a Christian man and I don't want to look at pornography, what I can do is I can download this software onto my computer, and it will keep track of everything I search for, or every website that I visit. And it will send an email to a designated list of accountability partners, and it will tell them what I looked at. And so if Sam visited some porn sites, then 4 other people get an email, and you can tag anybody. It can be your mom. It can be your buddies. And they will get an email saying, Sam looked at all of these websites. And the idea is they will contact you and say, hey man, what are you doing? I got this email that you're looking at all these things. And so it's actually a multi-million-dollar business. And this is where I have a problem with it. So, because there's the leading organization is this organization called Covenant Eyes. And Covenant Eyes is a privately owned business, and it makes millions and millions of dollars every year. But it's making millions and millions of dollars profiting by telling these Christians, and they're a part of it, right? Like, so they will publish blog posts and literature that talk about how dangerous pornography is and how you got to protect your family. Meanwhile, they are selling the software that you got to buy to protect your family, right? So, like, for me, that's a huge, like, it seems like they're creating their own market, right? Like by terrifying families into saying, hey, if you're not buying this stuff, your 7-year-old is looking at hardcore pornography every day, and don't you want to protect them? And by the way, this is $10 a month to put this on your computer.
I can't imagine anything that would make me want to look at porn more than the declaration along the line of porn. It's so good, don't even try it once.
That's right. Yeah. It's like heroin. Don't even try it. It's, and actually I'm almost quoting verbatim that narrative of like porn. That's a whole kind of subculture in and of itself. Like the Christian kind of psychology world of like porn shapes and rewires your brain to where that's all you want, like heroin, like it's like that kind of drug. And you can look at like fMRI scans or whatever of the brain of the porn addict. And it really is, if you ever read a fascinating book, Nick, I think you would really like this book, but it's called Solitary Sex by a guy named either Latour. He's a historian at Berkeley, but it's basically the history of masturbation. And it's fascinating. Oh, it's such a fascinating book. It's like 500 pages long. I mean, strap in. It's a tome, but it's such a page turner. It's such a page turner because it really talks about the history of what masturbation meant culturally, and why it didn't become this kind of medicalized thing, but like around the 1800s, it became this medicalized thing that called onania, from this biblical story of Onan, who God like smote dead
Right.
because he spilled his seed on the ground.
That's always sounded to me like he was practicing the withdrawal method.
That's what it was,
yeah.
right? It's not masturbation. It's really misapplied. But I would recommend you, I don't know if it's on Audible or something like that, but it would just be a fascinating book to read. But all that to say, a lot of the stuff that we see in the anti-pornography research now is kind of redolent of that early 1800s scare about masturbation. Like this is the picture of like the chronic masturbator who looks all deformed and kind of is worthless to the world. And that's kind of like, hey, that's where you're going with pornography, pal. Like that's what you're going to become.
Huh. Is the silence a good time to call it a wrap or not? I mean, Amy, if you have more questions, if you have more things you want to say.
No, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Thank you.
Yeah. We've covered so much. We could go on forever, but it's probably a good time to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Hey,
These
thanks.
are fun questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Love to continue the conversation at some point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
A lot of fun and great to meet you over the airways, Amy.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. We learned so much. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.
Great. All right. Y'all have a great day.
You too.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Professor and the Idiot. If you like what you heard, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a good rating. Your positive feedback completes us.